Hello and welcome to AXSChat. This week we're talking about accessible virtual learning environments. We're very pleased to have with us three guests. It's not often that we have so many guests at once. We're very lucky today. So we've got Robert McLaren from Policy Connect, who is responsible for the helping coordinate the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Assistive Technology. We've got Nicolaas Matthijs and Piers Wilkinson as well with us, who have also contributed to the work that Robert's been doing on the report that they put in on accessible virtual learning environments. So recently legislation's come into place that is requiring public sector websites to be accessible. This is European wide, and we've taken the European legislation and made it into UK legislation. It's a huge amount of web content out there that needs to be looked at, needs to be made accessible. And I think it would be great to hear from Robert, Nicolaas and Piers what they think about the current state of play, what they think the next moves are. So if you want to lead first, Robert, that would be great to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yes, so the APPG for Assistive Technology, we produced this report, which lots of people fed into, and which Blackboard sponsored Policy Connect to do. I was interested in virtual learning environments before I was really made aware of the regulations. Even from when I was a student, I'm dyslexic and had a lot of dodgy PDFs to deal with. And so when I started to learn more about the regulations, I thought, here's something that could move kind of a stubborn issue, which is virtual learning environments. And I think it's been an issue that's been hard to move because it has to be a university or college-wide approach. There's only, so much that can be done by giving an individual access to support or assistive technology. And so saw that opportunity potentially in new regulations to help bring focus and energy behind work on inclusive learning environments. And also I saw the regulations as something that would empower advocates of accessibility within universities. So when I go to conferences and meetings and speak to people, there's lots of people obviously working in universities, learning technologists, assistive technology officers and tutors who see this as a problem but are having trouble raising it up the agenda of their organization and having these regulations to point to and help with their internal advocacy. So our first step with the report was to get clear on what universities' obligations are and start to raise awareness. And now we're in a phase of to some extent still doing that, but also working with universities on what their implementation plans will be and helping to spread good practice around that.
That sounds great. I also experienced the dodgy PDFs, as you put them. And for those that don't understand what a dodgy PDF is, it's usually where someone's essentially turned a photocopy of your textbook into a PDF rather than actually creating a document with proper structure that can be accessed by assistive technology. So, Piers, what part did you play in the report, and why is it important to you for assistive tech to be and virtual learning environments to take that journey to be more accessible?
Well, I'll answer the second question first, if that's okay.
That's fine.
It's important because pretty much, since the DDA came in, 23 years ago-ish, universities have, particularly universities, but across the education sector, it's been predominantly a student-by-student case. They'll only ever implement. It's not been a sector-wide progress, and very much that came to light with the recent changes to DSA, the way in which sort of provisioned for DSA fell more on universities to provide. And that sort of highlighted that universities were catering predominantly to students on working it out on an individual basis. So there's a lot of disparity of accessibility across the sector, not only across the sector, across an institution. Quite predominantly, you'll have one school in a university or college where one subject where it's it's a very good inclusive environment where they're able to talk to their students and able to sort of work with producing accessible content. And then it could be literally in the classroom next door. You've got the polar opposite where they've scanned their textbook, they've just uploaded it to a PDF, and then they've just chucked it out in an email and hoping that everyone can access that. So it's important in that aspect because we've got more and more disabled people going through education, more students being recognised as having specific learning differences and needing a more inclusive environment. So from sort of the background, it's very important that the standards have been sort of upgraded, as it were, with this new legislation. And then sort of the way in which I've fed into the report is I'm on the Disabled Students campaign within the National Union of Students. And it's meant that my sort of colleague, or one step up from me, Rachel, has sort of helped me become part of the Policy Connect work so that we were able to get across the need for it to be a top-down approach in universities and colleges, rather than what it's currently, which is you've just got to hope that your lecturer or that your education provider is on the ball or is open to suggestions, rather than where currently I think Blackboard and GISC have got really wonderful statistics in a mathematical standpoint, beautiful to look at. But really, when you put them in context, they're very hard hitting as to how different and how the gap between what a disabled student can access and what a non-disabled student can access, particularly with virtual learning environment content, it became very much apparent that this work was needed. And then we basically provided a student perspective within the APGAT or APPGAT to sort of help make sure, as Robert said, it's an opportunity for those of us that have been working on this from a student level, from like a student union perspective, to be able to feed in and help drive the sector and the sort of the wider UK aspect, and ensure that the legislation or the way in which it's implemented is less of a burden on disabled students planning and more of a duty of universities and colleges and institutions to be self-aware, to be self-auditing, and to be aware of where they're currently failing and to meet the new legislative requirement and ensure that disabled students aren't facing a gap in knowledge, a gap in education, a gap in opportunities, because a lot of opportunities are sort of thread through the virtual learning environment at their unis. And then also just to sort of make sure that they aren't also the ones that have to do all the legwork or all of the work to sort of make things more inclusive. So that's sort of the background that myself and NUS have sort of put into the report, and are continuing to work on raising awareness of the report as well.
Thank you. Antonio, I know you've got something to say.
Nicholas, you have worked with Georgia Tech for some time, am I correct?
Yep, that is one of the institutions that I've worked for. That's correct.
So Georgia Tech, they have a very interesting approach to accessibility and inclusion. They do a lot of work in the area of robotics. What have you learned from the work that they have done there that you are bringing here to this, and share those best practices with your colleagues here?
That was okay.
Sorry, would you mind repeating the question?
But from your experience at Georgia Tech.
Yeah, and I would actually open up my experience a little bit more. So I've been in educational technology for the last 12 years, and I've worked at various institutions around the world. I've also worked at a few startups, and accessibility was a theme that very consistently came back. And what was interesting to me, and the reason why I think the virtual learning environment angle to this is so important, is that that tends to be the biggest challenge that an institution has with regards to accessibility. Arguably, the content that lives within the virtual learning environment, the learning materials, are probably the most important content as far as the student's concerned, and it's a real challenge for the institution, because they're dealing with a very large amount of content. They're dealing with a large number of individual content creators, all of the instructors that they ultimately don't have a lot of control over. So they've got this huge black box with lots of content, lots of accessibility issues in there. It's very difficult for institutions to get a handle on, even though that's the most important content, I would say. So basically, and what we see institutions do today, and this, or up until very recently at least, is we see them be very reactive because of that, where essentially they require students to come forward to them so that they can then provide remediation that's required, which first of all doesn't scale very well. It's kind of an expensive process. It's a slow process as well as far as the student's concerned. So I think there's a really strong need there for those institutions to become more proactive around this. And in order for them to be able to do that, they need tools that allow them to do that. And that was one of the reasons why I was one of the co-founders for Blackboard Ally, which is the tool that sponsored this report as well. But next to having the tools to become more proactive around this, I think the directive and the transposition into law is important, because it just provides a little bit more of an incentive for institutions. It sort of can help bump it up the priority list a little bit more. And we have seen that those countries where those legal requirements exist, such as the US, it does help in sort of bringing it up on the priority list and giving it a little bit more attention. So that's kind of why I think it's important. One of the things that I'm hoping with this coming in now is that we can use this as a lever almost to change the conversation to more of a rather than a remediation and accommodation conversation, turn it into more of a universal design conversation, and how improved accessibility can lead to higher quality course materials, more usable course materials in a way that can benefit all students. And that would help take this conversation out of the niche a little bit and into sort of more of the mainstream of what the institution does. And I think that's critically important. I think we can all think of lots of examples where improving the accessibility of the material ultimately leads to it just being higher quality and more usable for all students. And I think that's really, really important, and I hope can become more and more a part of the conversation.
Excellent.
My point in relation to Georgia Tech is that they have a history with accessibility, and they have a department focused particularly on that. Do you think, considering that where they are and what we have seen in other universities around the world, and particularly in UK, there are other places that have something to learn from the way how they are structured in terms of support?
So I actually did not directly work with the accessibility department at Georgia Tech. I had a slightly different role there, but I think the key is for so institutions that tend to do a little bit better around this, they are the ones that do have. First of all, they have people that kind of own this problem, that there's either a department or a set of people that are responsible for doing better. But I think what's key, and what a lot of institutions need to do better, is that this can't be limited to just a disability services department. They're typically quite disconnected from the institution, other than the requests they receive. And it's very important that they are well connected into instructional design, that leadership, so the leadership is buying into this, and that there's communication from the campus around it, that there's a policy, that there's expectations that are being set with instructors on what they're expected to do. So being a little bit more, I think what's key at these institutions is that they need to internally be as connected as possible between the different parts of the institution, so that this becomes a little bit more of a a little bit more of a mainstream activity almost, and also a continuous thing, and that training the instructors rather than fixing things afterward, that training instructors on how to create accessible materials from the beginning, that's the only way in which this can become really sustainable.
Okay, so this is echoing a conversation that we actually had very recently around sort of accessible content and with Mike Gifford, where we were looking at Drupal and content management systems. Of course, learning management systems are just big content management systems. They're just in a slightly different environment. And we certainly see this in corporates as well. So what you see in universities is not dissimilar to, large corporations also have a requirement to teach their staff stuff, and the quality of the learning materials varies tremendously. So that's because different individuals are taking different approaches to creating this stuff. So one of the things that was really discussed was how can we make it easier for people to create accessible documents, and the other part was around sort of and how do we sort of automate as much of this stuff as possible so that it's A, in the workflow, and B, just happens, because the reality is that not everybody's going to think about it. As much as we can raise awareness, we still need to sort of just make it happen in the background. So is that something that you've been working on with Blackboard Ally?
Absolutely, that completely resonates with me. I think, I mean, there's just to give you a very quick, and I won't take too much time, but just to give you a very quick overview of how Ally works. So Ally is essentially a tool that tries to make digital course content, digital course materials more accessible, but using a very universal design approach to that. And so in order to do that, it integrates very closely into the virtual learning environment. And then within the virtual learning environment, it does a number of different things. So for institutions, it's going to actually give them insight across their entire learning management system on how accessible their materials are, what some of the issues are, how things are evolving over time, and the ability to, I think, stepping aside or sort of stepping away from Ally for a second, just generally being able to measure how you're doing and being able to understand where your issues are and use that insight to help inform sort of where to direct your attention or your efforts, who to target for some of that works, for things like training, for things like outreach. I think the ability to measure is something that's been missing for a very long time and is now becoming possible with tools like Ally. So I think that's a very critical step. So that's one of the things that we provide. The second part that we provide is sort of the instructor-facing side, is that within the context of their course, we'll give them direct sort of feedback on how accessible their materials are, and then also guidance to help them make their materials more accessible. And this all comes back to, it is so important that this information is presented within their workflow, where they're already spending some of their time doing some of their work, rather than them having to go to a separate system for accessibility. Is just kind of in there, and it's in their face, and it's in their course, and they can very easily tell which documents are doing well from an accessibility point of view, which documents are not doing well, how can I fix it? And then the idea being that, it's sort of there as a constant reminder. When they engage with that and they actually fix something up, it just becomes part of their future workflow as well for future materials. So that's kind of the idea there. And we sort of see that as almost as a complement to any sort of face-to-face training that's organized at the institutions, or something along those lines. And then the last part of what Ally does, and this comes back to the automation part, because I actually agree. I think the more of this that you can automate, the better place we'll be in. And tooling is critically important around this, and tools like Microsoft Office are getting better at this over time. But so the last part that we do with regards to students specifically is that we will automatically make a range of alternative formats, alternative accessible versions available for the students. So whenever they can get to the instructor's original, let's say it's a scanned PDF, for example, then immediately next to that, they'll also be able to get access to an OCR version of that, an HTML version, an EPUB version, an audio version, an electronic braille version, a translated version even, so that we can start to offer, and this all comes back to universal design as well, we can start to offer students different ways in which they can consume the content, which doesn't only benefit students with specific disabilities, but also allows someone that goes running, for example, to listen to their materials, someone that's like on a train, they can listen to their materials, or they can put it on like an iPad or a Kindle, or and there's lots and lots of opportunities there, and it kind of helps broaden that conversation a little bit. So that's kind of what we do. But I think those general concepts of automation is important as much as you can, at least. Tooling is really important, that it just becomes part of the workflow, and then the ability to measure it and track it over time is critically important as well.
Thank you. So, Piers, from your point of view as a representative of the students, how have you come across the sort of the patchiness that has been described? Is that really representative of your experience of VLEs and of people using VLEs?
I think generally there's a large gap with what's accessible on VLEs, but it's also the integration of and the movement of moving more and more content, more and more processes onto VLEs. So I started university about 5 years ago, and when I started, a lot of the administrative processes were still done via paper or via going to a building. Whereas now I've seen a huge jump in moving really, really important processes and really important documents onto the virtual learning environment or onto the online intranet. So this becomes an issue of content being unavailable because, to a certain extent, the people creating it have never been given the resources or the training or the educational skills to produce the content. And then because they've not been aware of it, because they've not been even notified that, to a certain extent, disabled students exist in certain institutions, that you get a compounding effect. You get where being able to ask for help requires you to have to overcome the barrier that you're asking for help with for certain processes. But it also sort of links into, with automation, it's really helpful. We've seen a huge, most of the studies that we either conduct or we view from external bodies sort of highlight that the public opinion of students is they want all this content to be much more readily available and in formats that are much more diverse. I think Nicolaas said about being able to go running. I mean, in my case, as a wheelchair user, that isn't my sort of fun time, but it does mean that when I travel on trains for 6 hours, I can listen to it and not annoy all of the people around me, especially with movement towards things like Panopto and uptake of Panopto, lecture capture recording items. But it does highlight, when we talk to lecturers, I've been trying to do as much of that in the last couple of months as possible, talking to the staff members that are creating the content. And the one thing that I'm getting back more and more is, why wasn't this a requirement in our certification process? Why wasn't this a requirement when we were in school? And it sort of leads to a wider discussion of inclusion within education. We're talking about colleges and universities, but if you've got students coming up disabled students trying to access material whilst they're at school, they're going to struggle. And then when they get to university, they don't know what they're supposed to expect. They don't know what they're entitled to have, such as alternative formats, such as available PDFs that have got screen reader functionalities included in. And it's very much a conversation that automation within the sector is very good, because it, especially with Blackboard Ally, it gives you a very visual cue as to what's out there and what you should expect as a student. But when it comes to education of what should be available or how to create content, I think, as you were saying, within the wider sector, regardless of education, whether it's private corporations or businesses, there's a diverse, very, very large gap in what's good and what's bad and what the training is available. And it reminds me of when I was going through my GCSEs for information technology. We're taught how to write a Word document, but never once was it even introduced into the curriculum that I might want to make sure that I'm using the right headings, to make sure that a screen reader knows where things are on the page. And I think there needs to be a comprehensive, with this new legislation that does only apply to post-secondary education and public bodies, there should be a conversation about how do we make it a sustainable future. We can't entirely rely on automation. Whilst automation is good, it doesn't account for if a lecturer or a member of staff uploads a truly horrendous document, that automation, to a certain extent, produces what looks to be more accessible content, but it can end up just causing your screen reader or an MP3 format to just scream at you, which is a very, very difficult thing for a student to then know what the issue was. Was it an automation issue? Was it a glitch in the virtual learning environment? Or was it because the lecturer doesn't know to provide the resources or the layout or the template for that content? So sort of to go back to one of the important aspects of the student experience is knowing that it shouldn't just be on a case-by-case basis, is what we're currently facing, and that it's not an IT problem. So quite often, if a student has an issue, they'll contact the lecturer and they'll be told, oh, I think you might want to talk to IT. And then the IT department is like, we don't create content. We work with Blackboard, or we work with other providers to provide a space for content. I think it very much comes down to making sure that training is not just on a case-by-case level as well. So we talk about students not being given case-by-case support. Lecturers should also not be given a case-by-case training resource. It needs to be a comprehensive thing across the wider sector.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that's been highlighted again and again in reports. For example, when we were looking at dyslexia, the Rose report was quite clear that there was a need for teachers to understand about dyslexia as part of the pedagogy and as part of the teaching process as you learn and train to become a teacher. I think it's really interesting that whilst we're seeing this work being done on virtual learning environments, we're also seeing a repeat of what I believe to be the mistake that's being constantly made, which is doing this in higher and further education and not looking at the pipeline. Because actually, and I know quite a bit about DSA, having worked in the DSA business for about a decade, some considerable time ago, but understood that actually the people that were recipients of DSA were the lucky ones, because they'd either had access to the technology or had access to the help to be able to get to the point that they could get to further education, where suddenly there was an environment where you could get this assistive tech. Whereas actually what you've got in the pipeline up to that is even more patchy provision of help and care and knowledge. So I think we need to be starting much, much earlier. We need to be making these tools available in primary schools and preschools and teaching the teachers on how to use it so that we can create this stuff. I think that luckily we're at a point in time where a lot of these tools are becoming embedded, and that AI and other stuff is coming in that can help structure and give the metadata required for assistive technologies to interact well. And we had Mike Dolston on from Microsoft last week talking about immersive reader and learning tools in the Microsoft products, and Google are doing similar things. So I think this is positive, and I think we're going to get that change. But you're right, we still need a lot of education, and I think that's where groups like AXSChat can really help, and really help inform the people that are making the policies. And maybe, Robert, you'd like to come in and tell us a little bit more about where you think you can influence and use the contributions of AXSChat to influence that sort of decision-making process before we close.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thanks. So I think that's right. And picking up on some of the things that we've been talking about, is sort of making accessibility visible to the organisation, as Nicolaas was saying, so they can see what they've got, visible to content creators, because of course lots of people are uploading documents and they would have no idea. And instead of relying on the individual student to make things visible and shout about it for themselves. One of the things that's coming forward from the report that I'm really excited about is a further and higher education-led working group on regulations. So after the report, we created a gist mail to help people keep up to date with the with developments around the regulations. So, for instance, a little while after the report came out, there was further announcement from the EU about model accessibility statements and so on. But one of the things that we had the gist mail so that people could keep up with that. But one of the things that's come out of the gist mail is that some people on it have formed a working group. The initial suggestion came from Ben Watson at the University of Kent, and Kent has been working with JISC and other universities already on digital accessibility. They've been a bit of a leader on it, as others have been, and have brought other people into this working group. What the people who are in universities are doing is they're able to then create kind of guidance and resources that are going to be really relevant to their sector.
I judged it. So
and then what I can see as the role for the AppGat going forward is to help link in with Government Digital Service, Equality and Human Rights Commission, Department for Education, Office for Students, those kind of official bodies, if you like, to look at the guidance and the resources that the education sector is making for itself, along with disabled students and students in general feeding into it. Look at that and kind of feed that into official guidance, if you like, because whilst it's great for University of Kent and others to come up with resources and share it with some universities, we obviously don't want to see a situation where it's only the most motivated universities that ever see it or pick up on it. If those leaders are to spread that practice more widely across further and higher education, they need a sort of a stamp of approval, and they need to be fed into the official processes. So, one thing, I'll just say some of the things I would like to see come out of it. One thing I'd like to see is the Equality and Human Rights Commission have technical guidance for further and higher education on the Equality Act, and this new regulation references the Equality Act, so that if an organisation doesn't meet the accessibility requirement of the new regulation, then it counts as them failing to make a reasonable adjustment under the Equality Act. So it makes sense to me for the technical guidance that the Equality and Human Rights Commission produce. It makes sense for that guidance to be now updated, take into account the new regulations, and to give a lot more specificity around digital accessibility. Similarly, Government Digital Service have already put out guidance around regulations for the public sector in general. But I think one of the things that's come out of this conversation is there's lots of specific issues for education. And while some organisations might be able to take a look at the legislation, hand it to their webmaster and ask that person to get going with it, that's of course not possible within further and higher education. Every member of the academic staff is a content producer, and that creates a completely different challenge. And so sector-specific guidance from Government Digital Service is something that we've recommended in the report, and I think there's an opportunity for the sector-created guidance to then feed its way into Government Digital Service official guidance.
I think that's great. Antonio, did you have a comment?
Yeah. So today we have so many, technologies available for us. Instant messaging, social networks. What do you think? How can these advocacy groups around students, around universities, can grow and bring people together in order to reinforce an appeal for their rights, and to make sure that they can succeed, and students that are going to come to university next year will succeed as well. So what needs to be done from the advocacy side to reinforce the work that you are doing?
Basically, there's always been a sort of collective national students group. We've got disabled students officers in student unions around the country, from FE to HE. NUS has recently brought in the apprenticeships as well, the apprenticeship National Society of Apprenticeships. I think they might actually have an issue if I get that wrong. But it's generally it's about collectively working together. Unfortunately, one of the issues that we're having with social media, as you say, is that, for example, Twitter has the ability to have alternative text to images. But at the moment, we're struggling with Instagram and the sort of, I'm not a user of Instagram. I don't feel like I'm one of those cool people. But it's becoming more and more obvious that there needs to be more functionality in our social media so that we can have a collective movement that isn't always accidentally treading on each other. And additionally, NUS is very much, especially the Disabled Students Campaign, is very much something that we implore volunteers to get involved with, specifically disabled students. And on your campuses, maybe have the student unions and have volunteer groups support disabled students much more. It isn't a fight that, advocacy isn't a fight that we can win by ourselves, particularly because rather unfortunately, most of what we want to do and what we need to do are meetings in buildings that are still inaccessible physically, meetings that are difficult to get to, and it can't just be up to us as the disabled students to advocate for it. Very much is a collectivism that we need to do. And to sort of add on to the way in which the public pressure, it's not just students that need to get on board with this. If universities and colleges and public bodies meet these new guidelines and these new standards in a positive way rather than a reactive way, it's going to move the entire private sector up to it as well, because they won't want to fall behind. So it's going to not just help disabled students in the country. These legislations, the virtual learning environments, aren't just about disabled students. It is very much about the local community. Disabled people across the country access opportunities hosted by community projects within colleges and universities. So I think it really is just, doing your Google search, doing your social media search for the student groups, because they're very welcoming, particularly the disabled student groups, if I am a little bit biased. And it's very much about just starting that conversation, because if we all get together and we're all in the room, we're all having these conversations, we also learn more about each other, which I think is something that we're really missing at the moment. It is very much a conversation about very specific adjustments, such as closed captions or screen reader technology, when there are many more different reasonable adjustments that need to come in and need to be discussed about within the movement. So if that answers your question, I hope.
No, that's perfect, because that's somehow, from someone I follow the development at a few universities, particularly in UK, and sometimes I realize that people are having the same conversations in different places, but there's nothing that is bringing them together in one place. Sometimes they didn't even know that the existence of each other, and I think that they could win if they were able to collaborate more in relation to the topics that they are passionate about, and in order to achieve their aim. So we are about to close down. It was a very interesting chat, and particularly important in the area of education. We'd like to say thank you to Barclays and our Clear Test for all the support that they provide us every week. And I would like to invite everyone to join us next Tuesday at 8 p.m. London for a Twitter chat. I'm sure it's going to be particularly interesting, so you have the chance to join and engage with our guests that we have here today. So thank you so much, everyone.